saving a sinner like me. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The last chord from the battered piano trembled in the smoke-thick air of the gilded cage, hanging for a moment like a soul caught between heaven and hell, before dissolving into a roar of applause and clinking glasses. Seraphina Blackwood let the final note of her song fade from her lips, her gaze sweeping over the sea of rough, whiskered faces turned up toward her small stage. She offered them a smile that did not reach her bourbon-warm eyes, a practiced curve of her lips that promised everything and nothing at all. Her crimson dress, faded at the seams from too many nights like this, clung to her form, a splash of defiant color in the room's murky brown haze. Around her neck, the cool, familiar weight of a silver locket was her only anchor. Silas Croft, the railroad foreman whose money and menace kept Deadwood Creek in a perpetual chokehold, watched her from his usual corner table. His eyes, small and greedy in his fleshy face, roamed over her as if she were a piece of property he was considering acquiring. He raised his glass in a mock toast, a gesture that felt more like a brand than a compliment. Sierra inclined her head just enough to acknowledge him before turning away, her escape route to the small back room already mapped in her mind. But he was faster tonight. His bulk blocked her path as she stepped down from the stage, the scent of cheap whiskey and sweat rolling off him in a suffocating wave. "That was a song for a thirsty man, Sierra," he rasped, his hand closing around her upper arm. "Come, let me buy you a proper drink." His thumb pressed into the soft flesh of her arm, a casual assertion of ownership. A flicker of old fear, cold and sharp, went through her, but she smothered it beneath years of carefully constructed indifference. "I'm quite thirsty for some air, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice the familiar blend of velvet and gravel that kept these men enthralled. "Perhaps another time." She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "I say this time." It was then that the saloon doors flew open with a crash, slamming against the interior walls. A man, wild-eyed and covered in dust, stumbled into the room, his breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. He was the stagecoach driver, Jedediah, and his face was ashen. "Robbed," he gasped, clutching a bleeding gash on his forehead. "The payroll, it's all gone. They took it all." A hush fell over the saloon, the raucous energy draining away to be replaced by a tense, predatory stillness. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut preceded him by a good 6 inches and whose ambition had long since been pickled in whiskey, pushed himself away from the bar. "Who did, Jedediah? Get a hold of yourself. Who robbed you?" Jedediah's eyes darted around the room, wide with terror and confusion. He pointed a trembling finger not at any one man but in the general direction of the stage. It was dark, happened fast, but I saw a flash of red, a dress. "It was a woman," he stammered, the words tumbling out. "A woman in a crimson dress." Every single eye in the gilded cage, as if pulled by an invisible string, swiveled to land on Seraphina, on her faded crimson dress. The collective gaze was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. Croft's grip on her arm loosened, his expression shifting from lust to shrewd, cruel calculation. He saw his opportunity. Here was a way to break her, to own her completely. Well, he drawled, a smirk twisting his lips. "Looks like our little songbird has a secret vice." Panic, cold and absolute, seized Sierra. She knew how this worked. In a town like Deadwood Creek, an accusation was as good as a conviction, especially for a woman like her, the twice-widowed scandal, the gambler's muse, the sinner in the crimson dress. They would not need proof. Her reputation was all the proof they would require. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, an ally, anything. And then she saw him. Standing near the door, half shrouded in shadow, was Reverend Elias Thorne. He looked as out of place as a prayer in a brothel, his tall, spare frame clad in a threadbare black coat, his earnest blue eyes taking in the scene with a quiet intensity. He had come to speak to Croft about the railroad men's ceaseless debauchery, a fool's errand she could have warned him against. Now, he was simply a witness to her condemnation. Sheriff Brody lumbered toward her, his face a mask of weary authority. "Sierra, you hear what the man said." In that split second, her mind, honed by years of survival, worked faster than conscious thought. She saw the leering triumph on Croft's face, the hunger in the eyes of the other men, the sheriff's lazy indifference. And she saw the Reverend, a pillar of untouchable piety in a den of iniquity. An idea, desperate and insane, took root. He was her only hope. As Brody reached for her, she took a half step back, positioning herself closer to Elias. She forced a look of weary exasperation onto her face, a look that suggested a tedious interruption, not mortal terror. "Sheriff," she said, her voice miraculously steady. "I'm afraid your witness is mistaken. I couldn't possibly have been out on the trail," Brody grunted. "And why's that? You ain't been out of my sight, but you could have slipped out." She turned her gaze to Elias, infusing it with a silent, desperate plea. She prayed he would see past the lie to the truth of her predicament. "Because," she said, her voice softening, becoming more respectable, more demure, "I was with the Reverend. We were just in the back alley discussing of a charitable donation for the church's fund for the orphans. Weren't we, Reverend Thorne?" The silence that followed was absolute. Every man in the room held his breath, turning to stare at the young pastor. Sierra's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. She had just handed him a lit stick of dynamite. He could expose her, let the town have its pound of flesh, and wash his hands of the entire sordid affair. It would be the sensible thing to do. His clear blue eyes met hers, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, the tiny scar at her lip that seemed to ache with unspoken stories, and the sheer, gut-wrenching terror she was trying so desperately to conceal behind a veneer of defiance. He also saw Silas Croft, a man he knew to be a venomous viper, practically licking his lips at the prospect of her downfall. Elias Thorne had come to Deadwood Creek to build a church, to save souls, to do good. But he had not forgotten that evil often wore a respectable face, and that sometimes the most lost souls were not the ones who flaunted their sins, but the ones who used righteousness as a weapon. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "That is correct, Sheriff," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the thick atmosphere of the saloon. "Miss Blackwood and I were in a private conversation regarding a matter of the church. She has been with me this entire time." A collective sigh and a murmur of disbelief went through the room. Sierra felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, a relief so profound it was almost painful. He had done it. He had lied for her. Silas Croft's face purpled with rage. He had been so close. "That's preposterous, you with her," he spat, jabbing a finger toward Elias. "What business does a man of God have with a saloon singer in a dark alley?" Elias' gaze, cool and unwavering, settled on Croft. "The Lord's business, Mr. Croft, is with all his flock," he replied evenly. "Not just the ones who sit in the front pew on Sunday." The implicit rebuke silenced the foreman. Sheriff Brody, clearly uninterested in a conflict with the town's only spiritual authority, shrugged his massive shoulders. "Well," he grumbled, "if the Reverend says so." He shot Jedediah a glare. "You were probably just seeing things in the dark, you fool. Now get out of here, all of you. The show's over." The tension broke, and the saloon slowly returned to its previous level of noise, though now it was laced with furious whispers and speculative glances. Sierra stood frozen, the lie settling around her and the Reverend like a shroud. She had tied herself to this man, this quiet, sun-kissed preacher with hands calloused from building his own pews. She had pulled him down into her world of shadows and deceit, and she had no idea if he had just saved her or damned them both. Elias moved toward her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "I believe it is time I saw you home." The walk from the gilded cage to the room she rented above the general store was the longest of Seraphina's life. Every curtained window felt like a pair of judgmental eyes. Every shadow seemed to hold a whispering mouth. The dust of Deadwood Creek's main street swirled around their feet, kicked up by a low, mournful wind that did nothing to clear the oppressive tension between them. Reverend Elias Thorne walked beside her, not touching, but maintaining a proximity that was both a shield and a cage. He had dismissed her feeble thanks with a curt nod, his silence a heavy cloak that she could not penetrate. When they reached the rickety staircase that led to her door, he followed her up, his boots echoing on the worn wood. She fumbled with the key, her hands still trembling, and pushed the door open into her small, sparse room. It contained little more than a bed, a washstand, and a small trunk for her belongings. It was a place for sleeping, not for living. She turned to face him in the cramped space, her back against the closed door, ready for the sermon, the condemnation she knew she deserved. But he didn't speak. He simply stood in the center of her room, his tall frame making it feel even smaller, and looked at her with those impossibly earnest blue eyes. The silence stretched, becoming more damning than any words. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that? You could have told them the truth." Elias finally moved, walking over to the room's single window and looking out at the dark, sleeping town. "The truth," he said, his voice low and contemplative, "is a complicated thing, Miss Blackwood. I saw a man in a position of power preparing to destroy a woman for his own amusement. And I saw that woman was terrified. That seemed like a more immediate truth than whatever happened on that trail tonight." He turned back to face her, his gaze intense. "But that does not change the fact that you lied. And you used me, and my position, to do it. I want to know why." Sierra bristled, her fear instantly transmuting into the familiar armor of defiance. "I did what I had to do to survive. It's a concept you might not understand from the safety of your pulpit. Silas Croft has wanted me under his thumb since the day I arrived in this town. If the sheriff had taken me in, Croft would have found a way to be my savior, and the price of his help would have been my soul. I chose the lesser of two evils." Her words were sharp, meant to sting, to push him away. She didn't want his pity or his piety, but Elias did not flinch. He simply nodded, a deep sadness in his eyes. "I understand survival," he said quietly. "And I do not doubt your assessment of Mr. Croft, which is precisely why my actions tonight have put us both in a more precarious position. Croft will not forget this. He will see us as allies, and he will work to destroy us both. My word against his is one thing, but now my word is tied to yours. And in this town, your word, well, it is not held in the same esteem." The truth of his statement hung between them, cold and undeniable. She was a liability, a stain on his good name. "Then you're a fool," she shot back, her voice brittle. "You should have let them take me. You should have walked away. You don't owe me anything." "I owe it to God to stand against injustice when I see it," he countered, his voice gaining a steely edge. "And I will not walk away. I have told the town you are innocent, and I will stand by that. I will stand by you, which means I will find the real thief and clear your name. But you will have to be honest with me from this moment forward. No more lies." His declaration was so resolute, so absolute, it stunned her. No man had ever offered her protection without a hidden price. She searched his face for a sign of guile, of ulterior motives, but found only a steady, unwavering resolve. It was baffling and terrifying. The next few days were a quiet torment. Elias made good on his word, his presence a constant, unspoken declaration to the town. He began his own investigation, speaking with the grim-faced railroad workers who drank at the saloon, questioning the stable hands, and even visiting the frightened stagecoach driver again, trying to coax a more reliable description from his memory. His actions created a clear rift in Deadwood Creek. On one side were Croft and his cronies, who sneered at the preacher playing detective. On the other were the few decent townsfolk, the women of the church, who looked at Elias with worried eyes and at Sierra with open contempt. She felt like a disease he had willingly contracted. She tried to maintain her distance, to continue her life as if nothing had changed, but it was impossible. His protection was an invisible brand on her skin. She saw him from her window, repairing the leaning church bell tower himself, his rough hands, so unlike a preacher, skillfully handling the hammer and wood. She heard his voice on the wind as he preached on Sunday, the church doors open to the dusty street. Curiosity, a feeling she had long since suppressed, gnawed at her. One Sunday, she found herself walking toward the sound, compelled by an impulse she didn't understand. She stood in the back of the small, half-empty church, hidden in the shadows, and listened. He wasn't preaching fire and brimstone. He was speaking of forgiveness, of how even the most broken vessel could be made whole again, of second chances. His words weren't aimed at the congregation. They felt as though they were aimed directly at her, a quiet invitation across a chasm of reputation and sin. That night, unable to sleep, she sought the cool night air. She walked past the church and saw a faint light glowing in the small, weed-choked plot of land beside it. Elias was there, on his knees, not praying, but methodically pulling weeds from the hard, dry earth around a few struggling rose bushes. He worked with a quiet focus, his threadbare coat draped over a nearby tombstone. She watched him for a long time before he seemed to sense her presence and looked up. "I couldn't sleep," he said, as if her appearance in the churchyard at midnight was the most natural thing in the world. She walked closer, wrapping her arms around herself. "What are you doing?" "My mother loved roses," he said, his hands returning to the soil. "She always said that anything worth having is worth fighting for, even a patch of stubborn flowers in the desert." They fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of the weeds he pulled. It was a peace she hadn't felt in years. "The locket," he said suddenly, his eyes on the silver oval at her throat. "You never take it off." Her hand instinctively went to it, her fingers tracing the familiar engraving. "It was my mother," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It has a painting of her and my father inside. They died of the fever when I was 16. He stopped his work and looked at her, truly looked at her, his gaze stripping away the saloon singer and seeing only the orphan. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound and sorrowful understanding. It was a look of shared loneliness, a silent acknowledgement that they were both survivors of a harsh and unforgiving world. In that moment, beneath the vast, star-dusted sky, the temptation to believe in him, to trust this quiet, steadfast man, was a more dangerous and potent force than any sin the town could ever accuse her of. The fragile peace that had begun to settle between them was shattered a few nights later. The sound of breaking glass and splintering would woke Elias from a restless sleep in his small room behind the church. He rushed outside to a scene of calculated destruction. The new pews he had spent weeks building with his own hands were overturned and smashed, their pine planks fractured and ruined. The stained glass window depicting a shepherd, his one small extravagance for the house of God, was a spiderweb of cracks around a gaping hole where a rock had been thrown through it. It was not random vandalism. It was a message, signed with the unmistakable cruelty of Silas Croft. A crowd of onlookers gathered as the sun rose, their whispers a venomous chorus. They saw not a desecrated church, but the wages of their pastor's sin in associating with a woman like Seraphina Blackwood. Sira watched from a distance, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was her fault. She was the blight, the curse that had brought this down upon him. She had warned him she would ruin him, and now the proof was laid bare in shattered glass and splintered wood. She expected him to be broken, to finally cast her out. Instead, she saw a side of Elias Thorne she never could have imagined. He did not go to the sheriff, who would have done nothing. He walked directly to the railroad surveyor's office where Croft conducted his business. Sira, along with half the town, followed at a distance. Elias entered the office without knocking. He did not shout or preach. He stood before Croft's desk, his lean frame radiating a cold, quiet fury that was far more terrifying than any loud rage. "You have made a grave mistake, Mr. Croft," Elias said, his voice level, each word a chip of ice. Croft leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "I don't know what you're talking about, Reverend. Sounds like you've had some trouble. Perhaps your new parishioner brought it on." Elias took a slow step forward, and for the first time, Sira noticed the way he carried himself. It wasn't the posture of a preacher, but of a man who knew how to handle violence, a man who was intimately familiar with it. "You can tear down my church," Elias continued, his voice dropping lower, more menacing. "You can turn the town against me, but you will not touch her. You will not use her. This is between you and me now. Stay away from her." There was no threat of hellfire in his words, only a promise of earthly consequence. It unnerved Croft, who was used to bluster and threats he could easily counter. This quiet, unshakable certainty was something new, and he did not like it. He blustered, denying everything, but the seed of fear had been planted. Elias turned and walked out, leaving the foreman speechless. The act of ruthless, unwavering loyalty struck Sira to her core. It was a kind of protection she had never known, fierce and absolute. That night, she went to the church. She found him amidst the wreckage, a lantern casting long, dancing shadows around him. His hands were raw and bleeding, covered in splinters from his attempts to salvage what he could of the pews. He wasn't working with the focused calm of the man in the garden. He was working with a desperate, sorrowful energy, as if trying to physically piece his faith back together. He didn't seem to notice her until she was standing right beside him. He looked up, his face etched with a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. In the dim lantern light, she saw that the shield of the stoic reverend had fallen away, revealing the wounded man beneath. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's my fault," she whispered, tears she hadn't realized she was holding back now blurring her vision. "This is all my fault." He shook his head, looking down at his bleeding hands. "No, this is my fault, all of it." He finally sagged back against a broken pew, the fight going out of him. "I wasn't always a man of God, Sira," he confessed, the name falling from his lips for the first time, soft and natural. "I came to this calling late, too late." He gestured to a dusty trunk in the corner, a trunk she had seen before but paid no mind. "In there," he said, his voice thick with shame, "is a gun belt, an old Walker Colt. I was a sharpshooter in my youth, not a lawman. I hired my gun out to cattle barons, to prospectors, to anyone who could pay the price. I was fast, and I was proud of it. He stared into the darkness, his eyes seeing a past she could not. There was a dispute over a water right my employer sent me to persuade a family to leave their land. I was supposed to scare them, but they were stubborn. They had a son no older than 20. He came out with a rifle. I was faster. I always was. His voice broke. What I didn't know was that his younger sisters were behind him in the doorway of the cabin. The shot went through him, and it hit the littlest one. She couldn't have been more than 8. The silence in the ruined church was absolute, filled only by the weight of his confession. I killed a child, Sira. For money, for pride. I dropped my gun in the dirt and I walked away. I walked until my boots fell apart. I found a monastery and I stayed there for 2 years, working the fields and praying for a forgiveness I knew I could never earn. Becoming a preacher, building this church with my own hands, it's my penance. My attempt to build something good in a world I only ever knew how to tear apart. When I saw Croft threatening you, I saw him for what he was, a bully who uses power to destroy. And I saw you, and I thought maybe if I could save one person, truly save them from the evil of men like him, it might be enough. One soul to balance the scales. His confession was a torrent, washing away every preconceived notion she had about him. He was not a saint judging a sinner. He was a man drowning in his own guilt, desperately trying to find redemption. The holiness she had mistaken for judgment was a shield, not for his virtue, but for his own profound and terrible wounds. Without thinking, she knelt before him. She took a clean strip of cloth from her pocket and gently took his hand, beginning to clean the blood and dirt from the cuts. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firm and sure. He flinched but let her tend to him. "My story isn't what you think it is," she said softly, her eyes on her task. "The town whispers that I'm a black widow, that I killed my husbands for their money. The truth is far less interesting and far more sad." She looked up, meeting his pained gaze. "My first husband, Daniel, was a miner. He was sweet and kind, and he died in a cave-in a month after we were married. He left me with nothing but his name. My second, a shopkeeper named Thomas, took me in. He was older, a good man, but frail. He caught cholera a year later and was gone in a week. I was left alone, twice widowed before I was 25. The rumors started because it was easier for people to believe I was wicked than to believe a young woman could be so unlucky. It was easier for me, too. Their scorn was a wall. It hurt less than their pity." As she finished wrapping his hand, her fingers lingered on his. His confession had shattered her defenses, and in their place a raw, aching tenderness was growing. She saw him now, not as Reverend Thorne, but as Elias, a broken man just like her. A man who understood that survival sometimes meant building a fortress around your heart. He turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers, his grip gentle but firm. In the ruins of his church, surrounded by the evidence of the town's hatred and his own violent past, 2 lost souls found a fragile, desperate connection, a recognition that they were both just trying to find a way to quiet their ghosts. The wreckage of the church became their sanctuary. In the days that followed, their connection, forged in the crucible of confession and shared pain, deepened into something far more profound than either of them had anticipated. They met under the cover of darkness, 2 shadows moving through a town that would condemn them. He would work to repair the pews, and she would sit with him, holding the lantern, her quiet presence a balm to his troubled spirit. He started teaching her to read, his rough finger tracing the words in his worn Bible, his voice patient and kind. He did not preach the verses to her. He taught her the letters, the sounds, the simple miracle of turning symbols into stories. In return, she told him of the places she had been, of the bustling streets of St. Louis and the quiet bayous of New Orleans, painting pictures with her words that took him far beyond the dusty confines of Deadwood Creek. It was a courtship of whispers and shadows, of stolen moments that felt more real than anything in the harsh light of day. But secrets in a town like Deadwood Creek have a short lifespan. The gossip that had been a low murmur escalated into a torrent of scandal. His congregation, already thinned by Croft's insidious influence, dwindled to a few stalwart old women who looked at him with pitying eyes. Children who once ran to greet him now crossed the street to avoid him. He was no longer their spiritual guide. He was the fallen preacher, bewitched by the saloon singer. Sira saw the toll it was taking on him, the lines of strain around his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. The price of her safety was his reputation, his calling, his entire life's purpose. One evening, as they sat by the creek, the moon painting a silver path on the water, she couldn't bear it any longer. "You should leave, Ilias," she said, her voice barely audible over the gurgling water. "Leave this town, leave me. You can start again somewhere else, somewhere they don't know me, somewhere my name won't be a poison to you." He turned to her, his expression serious in the moonlight. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "Do you hear what you're saying, Sira? You're telling me to run. Is that what you think of me?" "I think you're a good man who made one mistake," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "And that mistake was lying for me. You can't build a life on a lie." "It wasn't a mistake," he said with fierce intensity, his grip on her hand tightening. "It was a choice, and the life I am trying to build is not on that lie. It's on the truth we've found with each other since. This church," he gestured vaguely toward the town, "these pews, this reputation, it's all just wood and dust and whispers, Sira. It means nothing if I have to stand in that pulpit alone. It means nothing without you." He moved closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face, his calloused thumb gently tracing the small scar at her lip. "I don't care about this town. I don't care about being their reverend. I care about you. I promise you a future, a real one. We can leave this place together. We can go somewhere no one knows Seraphina Blackwood or Reverend Thorne. We can just be Ilias and Sira. I'll build us a house instead of a church. I'll give you my name, my heart, my protection. Everything I am." His promise was a torrent of hope so powerful it threatened to drown her. It was everything she had ever secretly longed for and never believed she deserved. But his offer came with a price she wasn't sure she could pay: her independence. The hard shell she had built around her heart, the fierce self-reliance that had been her only constant companion, would have to be surrendered. To accept his promise meant to trust a man completely, to place her fragile, battered heart in his keeping. The thought was more terrifying than facing down Silas Croft or a town full of accusers. What if she wasn't enough? What if the sinner in her inevitably tarnished the goodness in him? What if her past was a ghost that would always haunt their future? While she wrestled with her fears, Ilias' investigation was bearing fruit. By piecing together overheard conversations from the railroad crew and pressuring a frightened clerk at the freight office, he had uncovered the truth. The stagecoach robbery wasn't random. It was an inside job, orchestrated by Croft to steal the railroad's own payroll. The cash was meant to pay the crew, but Croft planned to report it stolen, pocket the money, and continue paying his men in company scrip, deepening their debt to him. Blaming Sira was a cruel convenience, a way to eliminate a woman he couldn't control and provide the town with a perfect scapegoat. But as Ilias got closer to finding proof, Croft sensed the danger. He could not allow the preacher to expose him. He needed to silence them both, permanently. His plan was simple and brutal. He had one of his men plant a small portion of the stolen payroll money, a bundle of marked bills, under a loose floorboard in Sira's room. Then he went to Sheriff Brody, feigning the discovery of new evidence. Brody, lazy but not entirely corrupt, had little choice but to act. He came for her at dusk, hammering on her door. The search was short, the discovery of the money a piece of grim theater. Sira didn't even protest as they put the irons on her wrists. She felt a sickening sense of inevitability, as if this was always how her story was meant to end. Ilias arrived just as the sheriff was leading her down the stairs, a small crowd already gathering. The look of triumph on Croft's face, standing at the edge of the crowd, told Ilias everything he needed to know. Later that evening, Croft found Ilias in the half-repaired church. He didn't bother with pretenses. "She's going to hang, Reverend," Croft said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "It's an open-and-shut case. Robbery, theft of federal funds, the circuit judge won't waste any time. A terrible shame." Ilias stared at him, his face a granite mask. "What do you want, Croft?" "I want you to stop," the foreman said, dropping the act. "Stop asking questions. Stop stirring up trouble. I hear you're thinking of leaving town. I think that's a fine idea. Go build your church somewhere else. Forget all about Deadwood Creek and forget all about her. You do that and maybe I can have a word with the judge. Get her sentence reduced to a long prison term. It's the best I can offer." The ultimatum was clear. His silence for her life. His future for her chance at a miserable survival in a territorial prison. Croft had him in a cage and was slowly tightening the bars. The door to the town's makeshift jail, a squalid, windowless room in the back of the sheriff's office, creaked open to admit Ilias. Sira sat on a thin cot, her wrists chafed raw from the irons, her faded crimson dress looking like a splash of blood in the gloom. When she saw him, a wave of despair washed over her face. She had hoped he wouldn't come, that he would have the sense to save himself. He knelt before her, his hands covering her shackled ones. His touch was warm and steady, a stark contrast to the cold iron and colder fear that enveloped her. "I'm going to get you out of here, Sira," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her dark curls falling around her face. "No, Elias, it's over. Croft told me his offer. He'll let me live in a cage if you leave. You have to go. Please, save yourself. Go and build your house somewhere green. Forget about me. This is my fate. I've always known, deep down, that a woman like me doesn't get a happy ending." Her words were a plea for his freedom, an act of selfless love that pierced him to the core. He looked at her, at this weary, beautiful, fiercely resilient woman who believed she was destined for ruin, and his resolve hardened into something unbreakable. "A life without you is no life at all, Sira," he said softly, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that chased the shadows from the room. "It would be as empty as this cell. You are not his to bargain with. You are not a sinner destined for punishment. You are the woman I love, and I will not abandon you." He squeezed her hands one last time and stood up, his decision made. He walked out of the jail, not toward the edge of town, but to his small room behind the church. He knelt and opened the dusty trunk he had confessed to her contained his past. With methodical purpose, he lifted out the old leather gun belt. The leather was cracked and worn, the brass buckle tarnished, but the Walker Colt in the holster was clean and oiled, a relic of a past he could never truly escape. He strapped it on, the weight of it both foreign and sickeningly familiar on his hips. He was no longer just Reverend Thorne, the man of peace. He was also Elias, the man who knew how to survive in a world of wolves. But this time he was not fighting for money or pride. He was fighting for her. He did not go seeking violence. His first stop was the small shack where Jedediah, the stagecoach driver, lived. He found the man drinking, trying to wash away his part in the town's injustice. Elias didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. The sight of the gentle reverend wearing a gun was terrifying enough. Elias spoke to him in a low, even voice, reminding Jedediah of a few forgotten details of his past, a card game in Laramie that had ended badly, a debt still owed to a dangerous man. It was a subtle, chilling display of knowledge, a hint that the preacher knew far more about the sins of the world than he let on. Under the weight of his own conscience and the quiet, implicit threat of Elias' reclaimed identity, Jedediah broke. He confessed everything: how Croft had paid him to lie about the female robber, how the foreman had orchestrated the entire affair. As Elias was securing the man's written confession, a dust-covered rider trotted down Main Street. It was a U.S. Marshal, drawn to Deadwood Creek by the official report of the stolen railroad payroll. Elias met him on the steps of the sheriff's office and laid out the entire story, presenting Jedediah's confession and the evidence he had gathered. The final confrontation took place where it had all begun, in the gilded cage. The marshal, Elias, and a few hastily deputized townsmen, their faces grim with the realization of their own gullibility, entered the saloon. Croft and his inner circle were at a back table, celebrating their victory. The marshal laid the warrant on the table. "Silas Croft, you're under arrest for robbery and conspiracy." Croft's face contorted with rage and disbelief. He saw Elias standing behind the marshal, the gun on his hip, a stark proclamation that the rules had changed. It was over. But in a final, desperate act of spite, as Sheriff Brody was releasing Sira from her cell, Croft lunged. He grabbed a pistol from one of his men and seized Sira as she stepped into the street, pulling her back and using her as a shield. "No one moves!" he screamed, his eyes wild with panic. The town froze. Sira closed her eyes, ready for the end, but Elias moved. It wasn't the clumsy motion of a preacher, but the fluid, economical grace of a man for whom this was a terrible, ingrained reflex. He drew the Colt, not in a flashy display, but with a simple, deadly efficiency. He didn't fire. He didn't need to. In 2 swift strides, he closed the distance and brought the heavy barrel of the gun down hard on Croft's wrist. The bone cracked with a sickening sound, and Croft's pistol clattered to the dusty street. The entire violent ballet was over in a heartbeat. Elias stood over the whimpering foreman, his expression one of profound sorrow, not triumph. He had proven he was a protector, not a killer. His war was over. In the following days, a wave of shame washed over Deadwood Creek. Croft and his men were taken away in irons by the marshal. The townspeople, humbled and penitent, tried to make amends, offering to help Elias rebuild the church. He thanked them, but his heart was no longer there. That Sunday, he stood at the pulpit for the last time. The church was full, more packed than it had ever been. He preached a simple, heartfelt sermon not about sin or judgment, but about grace, and the courage it takes to start anew, to forgive others, and most difficult of all, to forgive oneself. When he was finished, he looked out at the faces before him, and then his eyes found Sira, standing in the back, her gaze fixed on him. In a final, symbolic act, he unfastened the white clerical collar from his neck and laid it gently on the pulpit. He walked down the aisle, his steps sure and steady. He did not stop until he reached her. He took her hand, his rough palm fitting perfectly against hers. The old gun belt was gone, locked away for good this time. Together, they turned and walked out of the church, leaving the whispers and the past behind them. They stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of the street, not as a sinner and a saint, but as a man and a woman who had found their own hard-earned salvation. They walked past the edge of town, toward the open plains and the promise of a future they would build together, a future where their names were their own, and their love was the only gospel they would ever need.